Welcome to the Restoration Church Podcast. We are an interdenominational and multi-ethnic community of Jesus followers who share the vision of partnering with God in the restoration of all things. Thanks so much for joining us today. It is good to be back in the saddle, as they say. Grateful for the preachers who held it down, didn't hold it down, who did great work while I had a few weeks off. Grateful for my friend Gino Kirkarudo, pastor of Table Church Philly, our friend, our very own Dorothy Yoder, and last week my spiritual director Tim Bathurst, who is the pastor of spiritual formation at New Life Church Philly. If you missed any of their sermons, especially, I know last week we had some technical difficulties. That midway through the sermon, this thing was changing colors. It meant that there was something wrong. And for some reason, right as this sermon was starting, I picked up my phone, hit the record voice memo, and threw it to the end of my row. So I recorded this whole sermon. So that is on the podcast. I encourage you to go back and listen to his sermon if you missed it. Really good stuff. I know you hear me talk about going the spiritual direction and things like that. Well, it's with that guy. So, believe it or not, we are still in Orthopraxy series. We have 2 more weeks after this, so this is we're getting down to the wire here. But we are talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, again, is the greatest sermon ever preached. It was Jesus' magnum opus. It was the culmination of everything he lived and believed and taught. The Sermon on the Mount was given to his disciples, right? There are these people who are following him. There's these crowds following him. He probably preached it more than once. I know we kind of can look at it as this one-time big event. It was probably something Jesus kind of spoke around, and maybe, you have it, parts of it in Luke, parts of it here, but this is kind of our most complete picture of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is saying, this is the law of the land in my kingdom. My kingdom is going to be a kingdom that exists in the shadow of empires of other kingdoms. But if you want to be my follower, you're going to be a citizen of my kingdom, it's going to look like these things. And what you'll see is there's not always a lot of overlap with my kingdom and the kingdoms of the world. Instead, there's going to be a lot of contrasting ideas. And so you're often going to have to say, all right, the world's telling me this, Jesus is telling me this, which one do I choose? So I want you to, again, always be picturing as we go through this, Jesus saying, in light of these major differences, this major value system differentiation that you see, will you follow me? Jesus is always saying, will you stay with me? We follow Jesus initially, become a Christian, however that looked, whatever type of initiation you went through, whether you threw a stick in a fire or walked up an aisle, all good things. Whatever it was for you, you always have to, Jesus is always saying, you got to stay with me though. Don't, calling Jesus Lord of your life is going to be challenged every day. What's it mean to be my Lord? Well, you're my master. That means I serve you, I obey you. And that's going to be relevant to everything. So Jesus is saying, just stay with me. Are you going to keep following me? That's what he's saying here. And last week we learned about the narrow and the wide gates, which is really central to Jesus' teaching. And this week we're going to look at something a little different. And it's going to be Jesus' teaching on false prophets or false teachers. And we're going to be Matthew 7:15 through 20. I'll read that for your hearing. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns, or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, you will know them by their fruits. I was telling Leah this week, I said, I feel like it's kind of a conflict of interest for me to be preaching on false teachers. I feel like pastors should be required to have someone else come in and teach it, because it's you get what I mean. It's I'm teaching how to discern a false teacher as the primary teacher. But trust me, I'm being honest here. This is nothing. Don't look at it. We're skipping ahead now. All right. So Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's he knows what's going to happen with the church. He knows he's going to ascend into heaven, and they're going to be left creating this community. And now he kind of refers to Pharisees and other teachers at his time as kind of being false teachers, but he's definitely looking ahead here and preparing his disciples for hey, you're going to go out, you're going to start these churches, and there's going to be teachers that rise up in these churches, and they are not going to be good. They're going to be false teachers. Let's take a minute. I want you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the word false teacher. You don't name any names. So just answer in your own head. What comes to mind when you hear the word false teacher? Because for some of us, it may come from circles, maybe your church history. It's not really something you heard a lot. Not really something talked about. Kind of a false prophet. I don't know. Not for now. On the other hand, some of you may have heard that dropped all the time in circles you come from. When you hear false teacher or someone's a false prophet, it might be a little bit triggering because, like the word heretic, these titles can be ways to quickly dehumanize or devalue someone, right? You sit there and say, someone's off on this, and well, they're a false teacher. Ignore them, don't worry about them. That's a false teacher. Get them out of here. And before you know it, that's a quick and easy way to just write people off. Because once there's a false teacher, they're dangerous. Get away from them. So, you may have a lot of different experience or no experience with false teachers, but what it isn't is someone who we don't like, we don't understand, we don't agree with on certain issues. That's not what a false teacher is. So today, Jesus does make clear, however, that this is something that is real. There are false teachers in the church, and what he does through these verses is show us how do we discern false teachers in the church. What does it look like? How do you know who's a false teacher, who's not? So we're going to do that right now. We're just going to go through these passages piece by piece. First, starting in Matthew 7:15, he says, beware of false prophets. Beware of false prophets. Now, what is a prophet? A prophet is someone who speaks for God, right? Speak on God's behalf. If you think of the Old Testament, you have two roles you see are like priest and prophet, right? Priest kind of, it mediates between humans and God. He kind of goes to God on your behalf. A prophet is someone who speaks for God. Right? They speak for it. And in our context, that would be like a preacher, like what I'm doing right now, or someone who teaches, or a Christian leader. And whether they're saying, I'm speaking for God because I'm teaching God's word, or because I have a revelation from God I want to share with you, whatever it is, when we talk about a prophet here, I'm going to use the word false teacher because that's, in a sense, that's what we mean here when we're saying that, and prophet brings up all these other ideas in our mind. And Jesus is saying here, beware of false teachers. So what he's saying here is, as you look at teachers, those in leadership, in churches, you need to be able to point out fakes, right? There are fakes out there. There are always going to be a few phonies, bootleg, right? And you need to be able to point out the ones who are fake. And if you know about dealing with anything that's fake, what that means is, on the surface, it looks real. But as you dig deeper, it's not real. And I know for me, I don't know if you ever watch shows like Pawn Stars or Antiques Roadshow or things like that, where I get those clips come up on my YouTube on my phone. And I love those because, someone brings in this family heirloom, like this lamp was passed down for 7 generations. If it's real, it's worth $1 million. I know this is real. My grandfather told me it was real. And the guy's like, well, that's a great piece. Let me, the guys who work never actually know anything. They're like, I got a buddy of mine down the street who's a world lamp expert. He'll be here in 5 minutes. Look around the shop. Like every single thing. And so guy comes in. He's like, this is a nice lamp. He's like, well, if this is real, you're going to be a very rich man today. But unfortunately, you see the way the rim patinaed around here? It's a slight silver gold instead of silver. That means this was a reproduction and it's worthless, right? They're like, oh my gosh. Or you have someone, oh, look, there's a price tag on the bottom. This is not that. A lot of times, or you get the signatures, right? People say, my dad was at Led Zeppelin concert. He got this vinyl case and he had it autographed by the whole band. And the guy's like, look at it under the microscope with their iPad. And it's like, this is a stamp, right? You can tell by tracking the ink that there was no crossing of lines, that this was one single movement that happened. Yeah, it's really interesting, these things. But what you learn there is like, wow, they're, to the untrained eye, it looks real, looks like any other thing, but it's like, you have an expert come in and says, no, there's some things you need to look for to spot a fake. And so what Jesus is saying here is like, here's how you spot a fake, right? Here's how you look for a fake when it comes to leadership in the church. He says, they come to you in sheep's clothing on the outside, but deep down they're ravenous wolves. So he gives this idea of a person who's like a wolf, but is in a costume of a sheep. And at first glance, maybe from far away, it looks like another sheep, but as you get closer, there's features here, there's some behaviors here that are not very sheep-like. And this is a wolf that's wearing a sheep costume. It's a fake, right? And then Jesus says, false teachers are like that. They're like a wolf that's wearing sheep clothing. But then he says, you don't like that illustration? Here's a better one. Let's try this. Let's switch from sheeps and wolves to trees and plants. 7:16, he says, you will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns, or are figs gathered from thistles? So in those days, farmers were constantly battling thorn bushes that were coming up into their crops. And this illustration Jesus gives is very straightforward. It's pretty obvious. What he's saying is, you know the difference between a grapevine and a thorn bush, and you don't walk over to a thorn bush and expect to find grapes. Right? You know the thorn bush is a problem, and we want to remove thorn bushes. So when you go into your vineyard, the thorn bush obviously isn't the thing you get grapes from. So in the same way, when it comes to teachers and prophets, the ones who are thorny, who are dangerous, don't go to them expecting good fruit. And then he continues with this theme of botany. He says, here's another illustration about fruit and trees you can use to discern who false teachers are. And he says, in the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. That's like, okay. Again, this wasn't rocket science to determine what a good tree with good fruit was. Two ways of knowing. Either you looked at the tree, it was unhealthy, and it was just like you could see this tree wasn't okay, or you look at the fruit. Who knows the movie Moana? See Moana? Anyone see Moana? Yeah, you know Moana? Yeah, right? So, in Moana, right, she's training to become the chief of the village, and her dad's a chief, she's going to be the chief, and so she's practicing kind of answering the problems of the whole village, and they come up, the fish aren't coming in, what should we do? This isn't working. And the farmers come up to Moana and they're like, look at the coconuts. They live off coconuts on the island. That's like their main source of everything. And they open it up, and a coconut, it should just be like plain white in there, right? And what you see is this rotting black growth inside the coconuts. And they're like, this isn't good. This is what's happening to our crops. The trees look fine, but we open up the fruit and they have this on the inside. She says, what about the other ones? They said, they're all like this. They say, what should we do? And she thinks for a minute. She says, cut the whole grove down, plant a new one over there. That's it. That's the only way we can deal with this. These trees are completely corrupted. We know that they're bad trees because the fruit's bad. They're never going to produce good fruit. So you have to cut them down, and we're just going to start over. And Jesus uses similar language here in 7:19. He says, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. If a tree has bad fruit, then it's not a good tree. And it's not only useless, but it also becomes dangerous to the other trees, right? If there's a bad tree, it's bad for everything. So farmers would cut them down, throw them into the fire, and you would burn them in order to remove their effects they would have on the rest of the crop. So Jesus gives this illustration of presumably judgment, a metaphor for that, and he brings us right back to the beginning again. He brings us right back to the beginning, and he reminds you, like, I've done all these illustrations about animals and trees and fruit, and in 7:20 he says, thus, disciples, you will know them by their fruits. You will know them by your fruits. So, he starts off saying, beware of false teachers, gives different illustrations, said, so, future reference, the fruits will tell you who is fake and who is not. Is everyone 100% clear on how to figure out who a false teacher is now? Kind of, right? Or no? Because the question we have to ask then is, what are the fruits? Right? What are good fruits? Jesus says here you are equipped to discern who is a false teacher and who is not. And the question we have to ask is, all right, who are the false teachers in Jesus' illustrations? What does this mean? What does it mean to be a ravenous wolf? What does it mean to be a thorn? What does it mean to be a bad tree? And Jesus says, they don't bear good fruit. A false teacher is someone who doesn't bear good fruit. So we have to say, well, what is good fruit? What would it look like for a teacher or a prophet to bear good fruit, to be healthy, right? Is it them having great theology? Having great theology, right? Or is it having precise doctrine? Having everything, all the ducks in order? Or maybe it's their style of teaching, right? They don't do topical preaching, they do expository preaching, or vice versa. Or they preach through the Bible one verse at a time, Genesis to Revelation. They don't do series, right? Is it the type of church they're in? They're a house church, they're a mega church, they're a traditional church, they're a contemporary church. Right? Is it their tradition or denomination? A good teacher is an independent Baptist, right? Or a good teacher is part of this denomination or that tradition, right? Who is a good teacher? What is good fruit? And none of those things, you can tell by the way I'm saying them, are what makes someone a good teacher who bears good fruit. And now later, if you look in the epistles later on, and Peter and Timothy and Titus and writings of Paul, we do learn about dangerous doctrines and teachers who teach heresies, right? A lot of them are about a movement called Gnosticism that said Jesus was a ghost. And so John makes it very clear, no, you have to say Jesus was in the flesh. Otherwise, you're teaching a dangerous doctrine. So those things are realities, but that's not what's happening here. Jesus is not talking about heresies or bad doctrines here or anything like that. Jesus is talking about fruit. And if you know anything about the Bible, fruit describes behavior. Fruit describes ethics. Fruit describes orthopraxy, right? So, for a teacher, bearing good fruit means that your life aligns with your teaching. The things I teach look like the things I do, and the things I do look like the things I teach. It means you don't only proclaim God's will, it means you also do God's will. In other words, whether we're talking about a wolf in sheep's clothing, a thorn on the farm, or whether we're talking about a tree that bears bad fruit, false teachers are teachers who lack integrity. A false teacher, according to Jesus, isn't just someone, isn't primarily someone who disagrees with you theologically. It's someone who doesn't have integrity. It's someone who does not live what they say. Someone whose life isn't in accordance with their teaching. Now, next week we're going to talk about false disciples. So I want to stay on topic here and talk about teachers. And I'm going to finish this up by giving application for what it means to discern false teachers. And next week I'm going to talk more about, as a disciple, what it means to be a false or a true disciple. But this week I want to particularly zone in on teachers. And probably you don't have to think long before you say, oh, a false teacher is someone who doesn't have integrity. Turn on the news. It's like, or go on Twitter, right? We're constantly learning about pastors who don't have integrity. They abuse, steal, cheat, all of these different things. And these things are all too common. And that's what a false teacher looks like. So the question we have to ask is, all right, what do we do with this information? Jesus is telling us to pay attention, to look for fakes, to find, who real teachers are and who false teachers are. What do we do with this information? I have 3 things to do with this information, then we'll be done. First, we want to identify false teachers. It's important to identify false teachers. And when you go into this, you have to recognize that identifying a false teacher is not pointing out someone you don't like, someone you don't understand, someone you disagree with. That's not pointing. It's not you going through the channels and saying false teacher, good teacher, false teacher, going through your theology books, false teacher, good teacher. That's not what we're talking about. As you live in community with other Christians, as you live and different people, step in places to teach, how do you discern, okay, is this person legit? Should I follow them, or should I question their words? And again, it has to do with whether they have integrity or not, whether or not they are people who live according to the words they teach. And what I want to say is, if you're around someone like this who teaches one thing and is a different person behind closed doors, you obviously recognize people aren't perfect. Of course they're going to screw up. Of course people are going to have issues. The idea here is a pattern of behavior, a lifestyle that is inconsistent with their teaching. And this can look like a consistent pattern of someone who mishandles funds, who abuses physically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually. Someone who is a perpetual liar. Just someone who's just a liar, who lies about everything. Someone who, sexual improprieties, things like this. These are patterns in someone's life that would say, this person doesn't seem to be bearing good fruit. The fruit is pretty rotten from this individual. Maybe we should investigate a little further and see if the tree is healthy or not. Because there's a lot of, people are complicated. So this isn't about you checking a list, checking off a list. It's about you helping to discern whether or not someone is a person you should listen to or not. So you want to identify false teachers. And maybe you've been around such a leader. Maybe you're sitting here saying, yep, I have been in that situation where I've had this pastor or this teacher or this leader, and I watched their life, and I knew things other people didn't know, and stuff wasn't adding up there. There was a problem. And what happens a lot of times in these situations, maybe that person was surrounded by loyal followers, and you knew if you tried to say anything or confront them, it would just get turned right back on you, and all of a sudden you were the one with the heart issue. You were the one with the sin. You're the one who was making accusations. You were the one who wasn't following Matthew 18, whatever it might be, right? Or maybe you looked at this person and said, man, they're really sketchy about some things, but man, they are so gifted. I mean, look, they're an incredible preacher. Or they're brilliant. Or they're effective. Like, they're bearing good fruit in other ways. I mean, it looks like I'm not comfortable with the way they handle this or this, but my goodness, they bring in people. My goodness, does it look like people are getting saved and baptized. I should probably not lay my hand on God's anointed in this situation, because it looks like fruit is coming, even though it looks like, oh my gosh, behind closed doors, this person is not someone I'd want to be around. That happens a lot of times. Or maybe you've just been threatened. Maybe you were like, you know what, I'm not going to stand for this. There's a problem here. This leader is not healthy. This leader is not bearing good fruit. And you were threatened, you were intimidated, you were silenced, things like that. In those situations, if you find yourself in the midst of a false teacher, you need to trust what you know and disconnect. Usually it's not worth the fight. Usually it's not worth trying to change the system, at least not immediately. Too many people sit for too long watching rotten fruit fall off trees because someone is a gifted preacher or evangelist, or they have such a big reputation, or they're so influential, or they're famous, or they're popular, or they're smart, or anything like that. What you need to recognize is you're smart. Like, you're actually smarter than you think you are. You're wiser than you think you are. You have better discernment than you think you are. And if you see bad behavior, and you know what bad behavior is coming from a teacher, call it what it is, and protect yourself. Protect yourself, whatever that looks like. And that's why Restoration, we take this very seriously, and we're always working to be, what does it look like for us to be a church of integrity? What does it look like for us to live above board in every area? What does it look like for us to be a church where leaders like myself and other leaders are not above being corrected, being rebuked, being removed? That there's no special privileges, that there's no secret weapons you can pull in the back pocket, there's no extra protection that comes in. There's none of that. It doesn't exist. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so important for me that we join a denomination. I talked about joining the ECC, Evangelical Covenant Church, and that's who we're in conversation with now, and recognizing that for a church to remain have integrity, there has to be oversight. There has to be as many layers of integrity as possible. You can never have too much. More accountability is always a good idea. So that's the first thing. Identify false teachers. Second thing to do when you're trying to look for false teachers, trying to discern false teachers, we can prevent false teachers. Identify false teachers, but also prevent false teachers. Now, obviously, false teaching is not a new thing. Jesus was talking about it then. But we need to recognize the unique ways false teachers are incubated within the American church culture. We have churches, we have a culture that incubate, that create and grow false teachers in a way that I believe never existed before. Because in my opinion, one of the biggest dangers occurs when we affirm and elevate leaders based on giftings rather than character. You see that? Far too many men and women have crumbled because they were pushed into the spotlight as gifted speakers, gifted leaders, gifted thinkers, gifted singers, but they didn't have the character to carry their gifts. You've seen this. You have someone who's like, wow, they're really skilled at this. God's really gifted them. But there wasn't the character, there wasn't the maturity, there wasn't the integrity there to actually uphold this gifting. Instead, you had this huge gap, and that means the gifting often brings someone down and they crash. And what we have to recognize is that developing gifts and talents, promoting someone with gifts and talents without the maturity to handle those gifts and talents is a recipe for disintegration. You want integrity, that means you're integrated. The opposite of that is being disintegrated, being broken apart as a person, not being a whole person. And this is an issue we have in the American church, is that we are too easily impressed by people. I know I am. Like, there's certain people, I'll listen to them, I'll see them, I'll meet them, and all of a sudden I've found this person who's like, this is the guy, this is the woman, she or he, they really have it together. Like, they're so mature. It seems like they're the best husband ever, the best dad ever. They're brilliant, but they're humble. They're a preacher, but they're spiritual. Like, there's like, oh my gosh. And, you know, I'll meet someone, I'll find someone, I'll start talking about, like, just, man, this person seems, I need to get mentored by this person. How do I become like them? And all of a sudden you see yourself like, I'm really impressed by someone who I don't know. Like, I really don't know this. You honestly don't know a lot of people. If you're honest, you know very few people. But this is someone I really don't know at all, and all of a sudden I'm impressed by that person. And we do this all the time. And what we do is, as a church culture, we celebrate gifting more than we celebrate integrity, character, and maturity. Integrity, character, maturity don't often get attention. Someone who lives maybe a not very flashy life, but a consistent, faithful life to their callings, whether they're married or not, have kids or not, have a job or not, who follows Jesus faithfully, who lives out their days faithful, trustworthy, someone who you could trust with your life. Those people aren't very popular usually, just because no one really knows about them. But we're so quick to obsess ourselves with someone who's an incredible singer, an incredible this, incredible that. And when we do that, we are setting ourselves up to be tricked, and we're setting otherwise potentially innocent people to actually become false teachers who have lives that look nothing like what they're singing about or teaching about up front, because they never had the maturity to deal with their gifting, and they were elevated to a place they should have never been elevated to just because they were gifted. So, second thing, we need to prevent false teachers. And third, you need to recognize that you could become a false teacher. Didn't see that one coming. You have to recognize that you could become a false teacher. Most people who prove to be false teachers, in my opinion, because I know a few of them, they weren't planning to become false teachers. Now, of course, there may be occasions where that does happen, but people I know who qualify as someone who did not have integrity when they were in ministry, who lived two different lives, they weren't setting out with the plan to become a false teacher. Things happened, and they slowly became a broken, split individual, and before you know it, they were preaching one thing, and their life over here was absolutely horrendous what was going on. But most people don't set out for that. That's not their plan. And now I know I said I want to stay in topic and talk about teachers, not disciples. But the truth is, in this church, we have a handful of people who in some measure are teachers, are aspiring teachers. Even if you lead a Bible study, even if you lead, teach the Bible to children, at some level, many of us are teaching. We are teachers in some measure. So what I'll say is this. As someone who's a pastor, who's a leader, who's a preacher, I can attest to the fact that there's always a chasm that's trying to expand between myself and my teaching. Like, you think of teaching right here and yourself, you want them to just be like this. Like, the thing I'm teaching is what I'm doing. The thing I'm doing is going to be consistent with what I'm teaching. And it's like a battle that you just watch, like, fragmentation happen. And there's this chasm always growing. You're always trying to get things to go back together. You're like seeing things drift. I taught this, but what am I doing? And obviously, we'll talk more about there's grace for that. This is not like a perfection thing. But there's always this chasm growing. You always need to have like so many resources in place to push you back. Constantly being resourced with other people who have different types of relationships with you, whether it's someone you pray with, someone who's a therapist, someone who's a mentor, someone who, a spouse, a couple you pray with, all these different things in place that from every angle can keep pushing you back together, because you are naturally going to want to disintegrate and fragment, and the goal is to be integrated and whole, right? But I can speak to that, that it's a battle to ensure that my teaching God's will is coupled with my doing God's will. And therefore, as a leader, as someone who teaches, you always have to ask yourself, is the thing I'm teaching, is the thing I'm leading other people to actually born out of a life with God? Obviously, you can't master, if you preach like every week, you obviously can't master everything that week. But the point is what I'm teaching, is what I'm leading, is what I'm doing actually born out of a life with God? Is this actually my life? And you're sharing that life, and you're telling other people how to live that life as well, how to be part of the life that you're already living. That's the question that always needs to be asked of teachers. And we talk about emotionally healthy discipleship a lot, and one of the key components in that is that your being with God must come before your doing with God. Because who you are is more important than what you say or do. Like, the most important thing is who you are. In a society that says your value is what you do, what you can produce, what you're doing, Jesus says no. What's most important is who you are. Therefore, your being with God, who you are in God, is more important than what you're doing, saying, whatever for God or anyone else. Therefore, if you see in yourself a growing divide between what you say you believe, what you're teaching and telling other people that you believe, and who you are, you need to bring that struggle to other people as soon as possible. That's something you need to take very seriously, because your gifts, your talents, your aspirations are good things, but they are not worth the price of your soul. A lot of people have been destroyed by God-given talents, by God-given giftings, because they let this chasm of who they are and what they say get bigger and bigger, and they never brought anyone else into the conversation. But living without integrity is never worth the price. Living without integrity, that's like an experience of hell on earth. You want to know what the effects of sin are? Talk to someone who's lived a long season without integrity, who said one thing and did another. And you want to talk about the destruction that happened. God didn't need to punish them. God didn't need to even step in. Sin comes with its own consequences. And living a split life comes with naturally all-in-one package of absolute destruction and devastation. So if you're rattled right now, if this sermon is rattling you at all, that's good. That means Jesus, I taught Jesus relatively well for you today, because Jesus is trying to rattle you. Like, Jesus' goal in this sermon is to get people's attention and say, wake up. Don't coast. Don't be apathetic. Wake up. Don't be asleep at the wheel. Like, this matters. Jesus is alive. You have one life. You're called primarily as a citizen of that kingdom, asking Jesus what you should be doing with your time. Having Jesus inform how you spend your days is the most important thing on earth. But our society, we're just constantly distracted and we're constantly asleep. And it's something Jesus is trying to rattle us awake today and every day, because though you may be a fully an integrated person in many ways, if we actually are honest, we recognize none of us are perfectly integrated. Many of us, all of us, in some measure, we are hypocrites. Like, this isn't like you're either perfectly integrated or you're completely disintegrated. There is a spectrum here, and Jesus is always trying to push us towards integration. But the question we have to say is, all right, as you're teaching this, as I'm hearing from Jesus, I recognize that I'm not totally satisfied with the way my life looks in light of what I say, I teach, and believe. So what do we do with that? We stuff it down and just hope, things work out in the end? Or our usual response is, no, we try harder. I gotta walk out of here. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to behave better. I'm going to look at what I believe again, take a second look, and I'm going to... And that's okay. The problem is that behavior modification also means you're not living with integrity, because your actions aren't coming from your heart. You're saying, all right, I believe this, and instead of doing these behaviors, I'm now going to fight and do this. But it's not actually coming from a place that wants to do different, that desires, that's naturally inclined now to live differently. Instead, you're now putting on another type of facade, one that just looks a little more consistent. But at the end of the day, you're still a disintegrated person. The answer instead is to understand, why do we have lapses of integrity? So by all means, behave better. But don't stop at behaving better. You need to get underneath the surface and say, why do I have lapses of integrity? What's underneath these issues, and how do I address them with intentionality? So here's some questions to ask yourself if you're someone who wants to be more integrated as a human, especially as someone who you think in terms of someone who's teaching and leading other people. First question is, ask myself, why am I moving towards this lapse of integrity? I see myself moving in this direction. I see myself kind of entertaining this or that area. Or I see myself becoming more and more like this person. You have to ask yourself, why? What am I missing in my life that is causing me to move outside what I claim my value? I claim I value this, but for some reason, my life wants to shift in a way that looks inconsistent. You have to ask why. That's a real question. You have to ask why. What's underneath that? Another way you could ask that is, why do I feel that my identity in Jesus needs to be supplemented? No. I say Jesus is Lord, Jesus is my all. Why am I really struggling though? Because I'm hungry. I'm hungry for money, or I'm hungry for recognition, or I'm hungry for feeling more appreciated, or feeling more respected, or whatever it might be. Why? What about Jesus do you feel like needs to be supplemented? And these are real questions to actually work through. Another question: what are my fears about being honest? I'm struggling right now, but I cannot talk to anyone about it. You have to ask why. What did I learn from my family of origin? When I grew up, what did I learn about honest conversations? Did I have honest conversations? Do I know how to? Was I taught either explicitly or implicitly to keep my mouth shut and keep that stuff to yourself? Or because we don't bring problems outside this house. No one out there knows what goes on in here. Where did I learn that? What have I been taught about telling the truth to others? Have I been, did I live to regret telling the truth in the past? Did I trust someone before and I told them a secret, and all of a sudden that came back to bite me really hard? Or I was just told by other people, don't ever trust anyone, or don't trust these kind of people, or don't trust that person. Where did I learn that? Why do I feel the compulsion to make my good deeds public? In other words, many times we compensate, where people tend to become more loud and more vocal about the very thing they're struggling with. And they want to make sure people know that even if they're really struggling with greed, really deeply, they want to put on a little extra show of how generous they are. For example, right? Where you see all kinds of horrible stories of people who are struggling with certain things, and they're coming out, and that's something they're really against right now, and all of a sudden that's the kind of sin they're struggling with, right? Why am I not satisfied with God's approval alone? That's not a condemning question. Why aren't you satisfied? No, it's a real question. Why am I not satisfied with God's approval alone? Does someone else know about my secret tendencies? We all have them. Like, we all have these things that, like, in secret, they're like, whether they're from our past or they're carrying into our present, that these are my, if it, you have these things where it's like, if it's going to go down, this is how I'm going down. Whether it's like you have this addiction, this drinking, this sexual thing, whatever it might be, about yourself, like, if anything's going to take me out, it's this. Everyone's got those things. Does anyone know about yours? Does anyone know about yours? Why am I unwilling to talk to someone? What about my life has shown me that no one should know that stuff? You were taught that from somewhere, probably in your family of origin. If that's something you struggle with, you were taught, don't tell that kind of stuff to people. That's not other people's business. You were shamed. Some glimpse of you came out one time, and you felt like a piece of crap because of that, and you knew it. I got to hide that part of myself. Lastly, why is it so difficult to live what I believe in this area? I'm pretty consistent here. Looks like I really live what I believe here. I'm an ethical person. I'm a generous person. And I really mean that. But then there's this area where, my goodness, what I say I believe and what I'm doing does not line up. Why? Ask those questions. And what you got to understand is that integrity and hypocrisy are a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum we're all on, and we're all kind of moving around on here.